Hello everyone, and welcome to the last SSP webinar of the year. This Scholarly Kitchen SSP webinar is the future of content distribution, licensing or leakage. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group, and we're pleased you could join us today. In a moment, we'll get started and hear from our moderator and panelists. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the question features to send your questions, or if you need to let us know that you're having technical difficulties. The moderator will review your questions and present them to the panelists. To help him, please specify to which presenter you'd like your question directed, and please also send in your questions as we go instead of waiting till the end. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you will receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so we can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You will also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this session and to the materials. Our moderator today is Roger Schoenfeld, who leads the Ithaca S+R Research and Advisory Program focused on libraries, scholarly communication, and museums. He is also a contributor to the Scholarly Kitchen, where he has been writing on discovery, seamless access, research workflow, analytics, and leakage. Now I'll turn the webinar over to Roger so that he can introduce the panel and get us started.
Thank you. Perfect. So thrilled to be here today. I've been wanting to organize a session on this topic for some time, and I just feel fantastic and privileged to have such a great group of participants joining us today. Let me first offer just a quick round of overview introductions. We have three outstanding panelists from across the scholarly communications, publishing, and library sector. Jonathan Austin, who hails from Springer Nature, where he's the Director of Product Management. Todd Toller from John Wiley, where he is the Vice President for Product Strategy and Partnerships. And Elaine Westbrooks from UNC Chapel Hill, who is the Vice Provost for University Libraries and the University Librarian there. What we're going to talk about today is a topic that I think is really at the forefront of strategic issues facing our communities right now. As journal articles have been leaking from publisher platforms, whether through legitimate or to pirate sites, whether repositories or Sci-Hub or Scholarly Collaboration Network or what have you, as a result, a declining share of usage of the usage of those sites is taking place on the publisher site. A declining share of the usage of those articles is taking place on the publisher site. And I've had a chance to write about some of the impediments to using publisher sites, some of the new alternatives that I've just mentioned that have arisen. And as a result of these actions, a declining share of usage is attributable to the library sales channel from the publisher perspective. And one of the things that this is driving is some tension about the value of the big deal, the value of the published journal bundle. And so what we're seeing, as everyone in our sector knows, is a totally changed environment in terms of some cancellations that we've all seen, but also some negotiation strategies that have really shifted. And so in this webinar, what we're going to do together, me and this really with these three terrific panelists, is to examine how publishers and libraries are thinking about some of these issues, and some of the steps that range everywhere from litigation to partnership development to completely new kinds of license agreements that they're taking to try to secure value for their users, and in the case of publishers, their businesses into the future. So Jonathan, Todd, Elaine, thank you so much for joining today. And what I'd like to get started with here is a question for Elaine. Elaine, you've repositioned UNC Chapel Hill in a lot of ways, but in particular as a leader in transformative agreements. You and your colleagues have been, I hear, I see, I read, speaking up more and more about the need to find positive models in terms of partnerships between, in terms of partnerships with publishers. And so I'd like to get us started by asking you a little bit, as a relatively new, but not so new anymore, university librarian, how much of the change that we're observing at UNC is basically a natural function of leadership transitions, and how much of it is really the opportunity and ability for universities to take on a new approach to their negotiations as a result of some of these changes in the scholarly communications system?
So that's a great question, Roger. And I would say that it really is a combination of both. And I think that being a new leader and coming to Carolina certainly presents an opportunity for me to really rethink everything that we do. And I think that I've been very fortunate that I have great staff, and they were poised to say, look, this isn't working out for us. We've been afforded a lot of opportunities thanks to the University of California. We're looking at our European colleagues abroad. And so I think that combination of so many things are changing around us, but it really afforded me that opportunity to say, let's look at our licensing. Let's look at how we're managing this from a technical services angle. Let's think about our campus and what our faculty want to do. And then I think the third part is really changing the relationship with publishers. And I think that's really been my focus. I think in the past, in many cases, it's really been this transactional thing. And it's just like, you have a product, I have a community that needs that product, I am the institution that provides that access. And now we're saying, well, it's actually multidimensional and complex. And I think that we can't afford to keep a transactional relationship. It has to be a very different kind of relationship where I see value, I see that the faculty have value, and that, of course, money is a big factor, but it's also about what does my community need and how am I positioned best to deliver that.
And that's clearly driven you to some interesting new, at least pilot relationships with some of the publishers.
Yeah, I mean, we're super excited about partnering with Sage right now. And, I'm not sure if I would necessarily call it a transformative agreement. I think that's yet to be determined. And I think it's actually a transitional agreement. And depending on what we learn through this process, it could potentially become transformative. But that is, again, I do see that as a partnership, and we're talking about what can we do differently? Things aren't working as they are now. What's the new future that we could think about? And then it's also brought me and my staff closer to this university and closer to the faculty. And we have engaged, I think, in far more conversations with our faculty than we ever have. And I think these types of agreements and thinking about the relationship a lot differently has really opened that door for us.
It's interesting that to hear you describe them both as transitional and emphasize on sort of partnerships rather than transactional, because as I was sort of framing out in my introduction a little bit, it's pretty clear that academic constituents can access licensed content through a variety of channels now beyond just the library itself, right? So whether it be ResearchGate or academia or repositories or Sci-Hub, and has that dynamic, I guess one of the things I want to make sure we cover here is, has that dynamic affected your position at the negotiating table? I mean, has that affected your posture or that of any of your peers at all that you see?
Yeah, I think the answer to me is no and. So what I would say is leakage has always been around, actually. However, the technology and things like that is making it more, what should I say, more prevalent, more possible. And so for me, when I think about the fact that I know that North Carolina Chapel Hill faculty are going through research or academia.edu, for example, I think it's telling about the problems we have regarding convenience. And so I think our faculty place a high premium on convenience and saving time. And so although I would love for them to see the library as their go-to place, we just aren't. And we actually haven't been for a while. And so when I think about that behavior of bypassing the library or using these other channels, my biggest question is this convenience changing the way they do their research? Is this convenience changing the way they read, changing the way they publish? And that's something I don't know enough about. And so I think that it makes sense that this syndication and the leakage and all these other things that are happening that, essentially bypass libraries, that's something we still need to study. And I think it's going to really depend on scholars and faculty to understand their motivations, but also to understand that they have that need for that content, and I don't want to get in the way of that process at all. And I want to find ways to make it to give them the content that they need, and really think about that as the value. I mean, it's not that we're saying I can walk away from big deals because there's all this leakage. I mean, it's not that simple, because it's much more complicated than that. But the scholars are definitely making these choices, as well as the graduate students. And that's something that we should look at carefully.
That's really helpful. Thanks for explaining that so thoroughly. So moving on now to Todd, I'd like to ask you a little bit about how a major publisher thinks about content distribution to the library channel. Is the discovery and access systems that we have today, are they effective? Are they fit to purpose? Is leakage, or this question, as Elaine was framing it, around sort of convenience and saving time, is that a factor? And where does this tussle with ResearchGate fit into all of these things from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a lot there. I mean, I think first of all, we should probably just define the term leakage. I think, which for me means abstracting the ease of access question for entitled users from other questions about the value that's being provided by publishers that are part of the open access question. If you just focus on the fact that a lot of people have access through institutions and they're drifting off of library pathways, which is a good thing in a lot of ways. I think I've been in this business for at least 10 years with some of these discovery platforms, and after years of just not a lot of change, with Google and Google Scholar and some of the library-based A&I, you suddenly see an explosion of new aggregated discovery solutions, like not only ResearchGate, which applies the social graph to the literature, or something like meta.science, or some of these AI-based solutions. I think it's a good time for researchers theoretically to be having new tools and new ways of finding content. So I think from our point of view, we're trying to figure out what to do next. I mean, journals have been online since 1995, when JSTOR started, and Science Direct was launched in 1998. So we're almost 25 years into having, serials be primarily electronically distributed, and yet we still haven't solved some of these key issues. Roger, you've written the most about these. There's a lot of issues with just basic technology problems with the way the linking infrastructure works. And then not to mention these sort of changing behaviors. So the researchers are on their phones and they're leaving campuses. And if we've kind of outgrown all the decisions we've made around our technical infrastructure were made in the 90s. That's when we decided to distribute PDFs and have IP-based access, and the real rise of the publisher platform. So I think we're on a verge here of the strategy shifting. But really, at the end of the day, and I'll summarize, is that we're trying to drive subscriber value. So how can that library subscription be most useful where researchers want to do it, and how do we need to change our behaviors to embrace that? Should I talk about ResearchGate? There's a little bit of
yeah, sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
You pinned that on the back of the question, but I think the ResearchGate to me thing is an interesting problem, because I don't know, you've got two kinds of issues, I guess, going on with ResearchGate. One is that just sort of this sort of debate about copyright and their stance around safe harbor, around user uploaded content versus what the obligations are of platforms in terms of protecting that copyright. And then you see the way this is breaking out in the debate around Article 17 in the EU and the position of the Coalition for Responsible Sharing. But I think more interestingly, which is coming on the back of the Springer Nature pilot, which I'm hoping Jonathan talks a little bit about here, which is you kind of have this bigger question. Has ResearchGate, by just being so popular with researchers and clearly of great use to them, become a de facto channel for discovering content, and what's the right thing to do here? Are you rewarding bad behavior by making them a legitimate part of the infrastructure, or is that the best thing to do? And how do libraries feel about that? So we're just extremely interested in these questions. I don't think anything's cut or dried, and we can't afford, to have like a real hardline stance on anything right now. It's really about serving the research community.
Well, there's, it's interesting to hear you frame things out as 20-year-old set of technical and infrastructure decisions, and some of the questions that emerge from that. So Jonathan, turning to you, what are your thoughts here about content distribution and leakage, and how the user experience sort of fits into all of this?
So I've been thinking about these problems quite a lot, and sort of framing it in terms of the value that we've been trying to provide in my part of Springer Nature, which really is in terms of trying to amplify the value of the research that's out there by finding the right audience for the research, making that research much more useful to the reader, and then connecting back what the reader is doing to the author and the institution. And so, we do a pretty good job and in a strong place of doing that on our own platforms. And we've invested a lot of time in that, but there is no reason why we can't do those three things in other ways. And so I'm sure I'll be talking a little bit more about ResearchGate in a minute, but through partnerships, you can certainly help find the right audience and make the content more useful and channel what's going on back to the authors and the institutions. Clearly, with pure leakage in sort of the pirates like Sci-Hub, that really just isn't possible to add value in that way. So it's definitely quite easy to discriminate between different flavors of people in that space.
When we spoke the other day, you talked a little bit about some of the ways that you felt that the existing system, even putting aside third-party partnerships like ResearchGate, that the existing system could be improved and is being improved. Do you want to say a word or two about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so in terms of finding the right audience for the content, we have to accept that people, the model that it started out in 1995 is changing, and people are accessing content in different ways. It's perfectly reasonable for an institution to start reading a paper at their desk and to continue reading it and follow links on the bus on the way home. And the current mechanism for granting access around whitelisting IPs just doesn't really enable that. And so one of the ways we've been exploring improving that is the Seamless Access Initiative, which enables people to continue that work on the bus or on the train on the way home by logging in through the RA21 methods and carry on that journey. So that's just one way in which we're sort of really updating how our platforms work, moving on from a situation that hasn't changed in quite a long time. So it's a really interesting time. That's just one example. There are many others.
And obviously, I think one of the key things that I'm interested in connecting back to from a Springer Nature perspective is what I think of as these very interesting pilot efforts that you've taken on with ResearchGate. So, do you want to describe that a little bit and tell us a little bit about its purpose and some of what you're learning from that?
Yeah, sure. So we started working with ResearchGate in 2018, and with the agreement that Stephen Inchcombe announced to support better ways of content sharing, clarifying the situation essentially, and sort of getting better visibility of what's really going on in ResearchGate, which at the time was for us a bit of a black box. And then we moved this year into some content trials, the first one in March, and that changed a little bit over the summer. And as you might expect with a new relationship, initially there was lots of talking, right? Getting to know each other and discovering what two very different companies had in common, and sort of identifying the shared values and what we want to do. So clearly learning that we are both really set up to serve researchers and wanting to be really a catalyst for change in an industry, as Todd said, hadn't really changed much in a number of years. And what was fascinating about that is discovering how different companies approach the same problem in completely different ways. You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about content and publishing it. They have their network, and that leads to just different ways of tackling the same problem. So we spent, you know, the first period just really sort of talking and trying to find a common vocabulary about how we could work together. But when it came round to March, we basically decided that we just wanted to try something, right? And what we did was to make the version of record directly available to authors on ResearchGate, and to really sit back and see how it was received, how it was used, and to start learning about it. We didn't solve all the technical problems that you might wish to do in day one. We just wanted to get started, really, and to learn how we might be greater than the sum of our parts. And clearly, if people hated it, then really there was no problem, no point going further. But clearly, people really loved it, and both authors and readers. And so over the summer, we really expanded the content that we shared with ResearchGate, and began sort of doing some of those more difficult problems around authentication and access. And I think it was 2 weeks ago we started to just review the results of that.
So it's interesting, like that's, you know, Todd sort of Todd referred to, you know, a question about rewarding bad behavior, but, you know, obviously from a Springer Nature perspective, there's some other kind of motivation here, right? Like it's an interesting difference in perspectives that maybe we'll explore further. But Elaine, I guess what I'm wondering from your perspective, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but, you know, just kind of reflecting on what the other panelists have been speaking about, how does a library think about this question of new distribution mechanisms, right? I mean, in a way, you know, there's an existing system that kind of is where the you know, library licenses something from a publisher. The publisher platform is the principal site through which those materials are made available. There's all sorts of you know, discovery services, many of which the library might pay for or play a role in enabling. There's a sort of authentication layer that the library has traditionally provided through a proxy, or, you know, there's all those different kinds of technical steps along the way. Then there's a, you know, and as Todd mentioned, you know, some of those pieces are kind of technically outdated in a variety of different ways. I mean, we all know that. So, and then we have a new service, relatively newer service like ResearchGate, that for whatever set of reasons has drawn so many users to it. How does the library think about the value of adding a new distribution mechanism for content that it's licensed, right, Jonathan? Like that's one of the issues here. Like this is there's an authentication or a mechanism for giving the library licensed users version of record access through ResearchGate now. Elaine, can you sort of reflect a little bit on that? Like, if it were to grow, like, would you be excited for additional seamlessness that sounds like that's going to enable, or would you be concerned? I mean, people have raised privacy issues. Like, how does the library like grapple with this potential for a change that it may not actually be able to control as much as it might, or maybe it can? I'm not sure.
So I would say generally I'm agnostic about this, except for when it comes to privacy. So I think that, you know, I hope that the researchers here at Carolina and at any other institution are really aware of what's happening when they engage in these platforms, right? And although vendors and publishers and other groups may not be collecting huge amounts of data about the researchers, it's possible that they will, or that they've set up infrastructure that makes it possible, easy, simple and opaque the way that they are collecting information and data about its users. And so I don't want to paint everybody in the same, basket as, Facebook and some of these other ones, but people need to make informed decisions about what they're willing to do with these third-party platforms. The second thing I'd like to mention is that regardless of how people are getting their content, there's finite resources, right? And so I only have so much money to pay for subscriptions. And even if a publisher is telling me, oh my goodness, like people love this stuff, this is great, like it's getting more usage and more and more and more. In some ways, that's not the compelling story that I need because of finite resources. And then I think the third part is, I know my institution in general, and I think many others, are thinking about use and value in different ways. And so just because an article is downloaded many times doesn't mean that I need to pay for it, right? And I think that what I'm seeing is that there are titles that are extremely valuable because people read them and people publish them, right? But there's a lot of titles that people just read that they don't publish in, right? And so to me, those are two types of situations, and I want to be in the place where people are reading it. I want to deliver that content or subscribe to that content that they read and publish in. And I think those are two different dynamics and two different situations that I think I'm seeing. And so when I take something like a Lancet, a Cell, a Science, it's very clear that those are read and those are the places that people want to publish. And then I think about hundreds of other titles that, it's pretty up in the air. And that final part that I didn't complete is that we want a more nuanced understanding of value and use. And that goes far beyond downloads. It depends on the discipline. It depends on the size of the discipline, the department, how they communicate. There are all these other nuances that I think have to be part of the discussion as to what determines the value of content.
Yeah, that's a really helpful and nuanced perspective. Thank you. It's interesting how much work is going into addressing the access questions at the same time as Elaine was just describing, as you were just describing, Elaine, I think many libraries are trying to move beyond a kind of counter compliant number of download type of approach to assessing values. So I wonder if those things are in parallel or not least because because so many parts of this community are moving towards open access models, right? Which in a way is reflected, Elaine, in what you were saying about putting more resource into thinking about where do people want to publish and not just about where do they want to read. But I do wonder how these questions that all three of you are circling around here about content distribution, content access, content discovery, they don't become less strategic in an open access environment exactly, do they? Or do they, from your perspective? I shouldn't lead with the question. How do leakage and content distribution, how does the question of where does a user access an article, or how seamless is it for them to discover and use, and how much time is saved or time is spent? How do those questions work differently from a strategic perspective or from a user perspective in an increasingly open access environment? I'm going to put that question to each of you, if each of you would like to reflect on that. And just before I do that, just a quick word to everyone on the webinar. We'll have some time for questions, and so if you have questions, now is a great time to start. Make sure you have a chance to put them into the queue. But for the panelists, how will we think about these issues differently in an increasingly open access environment? Or put another way, how are your answers today informed by the fact that we're already well into an open access environment? Maybe that's the other piece of it. Should I call on someone, or would someone like to volunteer to go first?
I'll go first. I think it depends whether we're talking about PDF world or post PDF world. I think one of my big focuses and projects here is kind of retooling the journal publishing infrastructure, which is still mostly print based. Still go through typesetters, and we create PDFs first, and authors do their whole revision workflow around PDFs, and can't handle data, and they can't peer review Jupyter notebooks, and we can't publish linked data and things that I think aren't serving science. So I think as publishers you're already seeing this with OA native publishers like eLife starting to retool these workflows. I do see a future where the output is something that's more interactive and more useful for researchers to actually do research on. In which case, I think this question of where does the PDF live is much different. And I think there could be more of a living article, and it's easier. There needs to be basically this pipeline that goes back to the submission and peer review process to the published output. But I think over time this will shift. Right now, it's a confusing question about whether we should treat the open access content like we think about, in terms of capturing all the signals back for the authors, who we serve. In theory, that makes sense, but we've got such a complicated landscape. I mean, one thing I didn't really mention was it's not just gold OA that we're publishing. It's the fact that we have a lot of our content rolling onto green OA, and there's also legal, versions that authors are allowed to share and deposit author accepted manuscripts. So I've done an analysis, 65% of our content, there's some version of it free online somewhere. It's completely legal. So it's just right now, it's kind of a particularly complicated landscape. And I think about even that OA question of, is the user finding the VOR the best version they can, or are they often some other version of the content? So I think, I guess there's two ways to kind of approach that.
That's really
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just to add to that. I mean, obviously, the move to OA doesn't solve all of the problems that researchers have. Science continues to be difficult to understand. Papers aren't necessarily easy to read. So success will come from companies who are able to do a good job in making the content much more continues to make it more useful and understandable and linked to the kind of material that makes it easier to understand. OA isn't necessarily going to make that easier, but it introduces some other problems that we have to address. One of the ones that I've been thinking about a lot is around provenance and how you ensure the provenance of the article is maintained. It's not very hard to go around to look on internet sites and see versions of the article that have been corrected, or indeed in some cases retracted, being offered as the version of record. And that is very, very worrying. If there is, the things that keep me up at night are errors in medical papers that need to be corrected. You don't know for sure that you are getting the right version on some sites, and part of the value that a publisher must offer is that provenance and guarantee that this has gone through. Clearly it goes through the peer review process, but also the quality, and make sure you're getting the most up-to-date version, ensuring that is the case. And the other problem is that, the increasing proliferation of science out of there, ensuring, the signal to noise. I mean, obviously working for, a company like, with Nature in its title, which sort of spent the last 150 years looking at ensuring the signal is there and amongst all the other stuff that's going on. That is also a problem that we're having to face. And making sure that the right article is put in front of the researcher at the right time, again, is an unsolved problem in an OA world that a publisher will need to take a role in. And in doing so with partnerships with other people, and making sure that, as I say, that connecting back to the author, how their work is being used on this distributed environment, or to the institutions as well. Again, there is another role for publishers to take in that OA world.
So Roger, I guess I would focus on this idea that, the OA content is certainly growing. And I think that the growth of that with regard to the version of record and things like that, I could see how publishers would certainly be concerned about that prospect. But I think from my perspective, open access is an outlet, but the fact that it's present doesn't really change my strategy at all, right? And so there's still going to be subscribed content for a little while. And I know, of course, Plan S and things like that are thinking differently. But I have to think about this midterm area where we have the hybrids and we have content that is where you're only going to get access through subscriptions. And so that's where I actually want to focus my energies. And I think this goes to some of the things that Todd had mentioned is, this system is it's an antiquated system. Like we desperately need some change in thinking about what is the kind of content? Is it a long form or short form manuscript? And should it be more dynamic? And I think we need more pressure to rethink of peer review and to think about the metrics that are currently being used. That the idea that the quality of a paper is irrelevant or less important than the quality of the journal. I mean, these are long-standing problems that we see that are going to need to be interrogated from all the angles and within the complete ecosystem. And so that's scholars, that's publishers, that's librarians, really need to think about it because it's just not changing fast enough, and we're not really leveraging the technologies that we have. Like this should be the digital transformation hasn't fully happened in any way, and it's been, these electronic journals, like we said, they've been around since '95, yet they still seem to be more like a print. They're stuck in this print workflow. So I think we really have to think about those, really look inward and much more deeply at these bigger problems around peer review, how we disseminate the process, because that's ultimately what we need most to serve science and as a public institution. I mean, it has to be the citizens of the state should have access to the research going on at this university, and they don't. And so the fact that we're public and of the public, and that is so important to our mission, we have to constantly push to reinvent the systems and to think about open access in different ways, because that's the mandate I'm getting from my campus is how dare you, like as a public, lock everything or be part of a system that locks a lot of knowledge behind paywalls.
And it's interesting. Several of you, Elaine, you just were emphasizing as well. Questions about how these materials become more dynamic. How they, sorry, I'm like pushing my hand at the camera. Sorry about that. Become more dynamic. How the questions about how they interoperate with, whether it's data sets or protocols, or I think it was Todd who called it this sort of post-PDF environment, which I think is another way of saying some of the things that you were talking about a minute ago, Elaine, as well. And so I guess I am wondering, is the idea of partnering with a third party, and we don't have to here talk about ResearchGate, it could be ProQuest or EBSCO just as readily, or whoever, but from a publisher perspective, is it harder to innovate if you have third party distribution partners, or is that not a factor in how you would be thinking about some issues?
You want to take that, Jonathan?
Okay, so the way we've been sort of framing this, recently with ResearchGate is we both bring things to the party in making a researcher's life easier. Clearly, as Elaine said, first thing we do is, as a publisher, we want to get the research to where the researcher is, to make it convenient, to save time, to make things easier. But going beyond that, there are things that we are good at, and there are things that they are good at, and there are things that we could only really do together. And so we know our content better than anyone, and the investment we've made in being able to make science accessible and readable on the web. We've invested a lot of time in that, and so we are able to offer a lot of value there. And so, not one size doesn't fit all in this post-PDF world. Different content needs to be presented in different ways. Innovation around video, that sort of thing. We're clearly very well positioned to do that. On our sites, on the other hand, we have commenting. People can comment on Nature articles, and we discover that it's quite a difficult ask to ask people to comment on a Nature article in a public forum. However, ResearchGate with its network can really encourage discussion around the article and collaboration in the article, and manage the critical privacy aspect and the relationship between the author and researcher, and we can help feed some of that collaboration as well. And getting to good is when these two worlds intermingle in terms of a specific conversation about a particular aspect of content, that sort of thing. That's where we get to good. And so so we start off identifying our strengths, and then we'll identify the things that we can only do together. Does that answer the question?
From my perspective, it's really, yeah, absolutely. One of the questions that came in, and maybe you've already started to answer it, Jonathan, but was I'll just read it because it was well formulated. While recognizing that ResearchGate may offer value as a distribution partner, are there things that publishers can do to add value to their platforms and redirect users to the version of record on the publisher site? Any success stories you can share on that? And Todd, I don't know if you want to take a first crack at that, but I think that's an interesting question as well.
I think it's interesting because what's happening on the publisher site, it's like, for instance, that's where the publication has context. That's where editors put a lot of time into thinking about how to curate the articles and the publications themselves that kind of live in their web context on the publisher platform. And sometimes that has a real use. I deal with a lot of editors who put a lot of time into thinking about their publication, and we just assume everyone's searches is completely publisher agnostic, kind of comes in and out of those platforms without paying attention, and that's mostly true, but it's not always true. And there's a lot, I think, of room about what publications can do. And I think Elaine raised a good point about whether the journal brand versus the article is an enduring concept, and whether that holds in this future, especially as live. And that was my question. Not to change the topic to Elaine, but I mean, I really see one of the major trends is in this world where everything's online, do libraries still think about their holdings? Is it still a collection development mindset, which is very much driven off these brands and titles? And if that breaks down, then that role of that publisher site might be completely different. So, that I think of it more in those phrases. And I've tried the game, like the hide the PDF game on the platform, and it doesn't work. You can't keep researchers from looking for that PDF and getting out of there. And they're not gonna, only 3% of our users or something are gonna log into Wiley, which has about 7% of the journal content, in order to do some kind of interaction like commenting. That's something they want to do in a more aggregated context and makes perfect sense to me. So I tend to think of it along that kind of bigger dimension, like what is the role of the publication?
Yeah.
In our world, I mean, there's been a lot of change, and it's been relatively successful. And the things that our approach is to strip things out and get out of the way of the researcher as they try to engage with a piece of scientific content. So a radical simplicity of the presentation of the science has been something that we've had a lot of success with. Science is complicated enough without publishing sites adding to the burden in terms of trying to read it. Where we again, working with titles like Nature, where we invest in a lot of journalism and commentary and reviews around articles, being able to link that to help researchers understand the article and engage with the article and then apply the article is something that we've had an awful lot of success with, and really sort of leans into the sort of the values you have in the sort of that nature brand, and we'll be doing an awful lot more of that.
Thanks to you both.
I wanted to actually respond to something that Todd had mentioned, and also Jonathan had alluded to. And I think that now we're at this point among research libraries where we don't obsess over holdings and we don't try to buy as much stuff anymore. Like, that train has passed. We know that great libraries are not solely about the one that has the most books and journals. And I think that a lot of institutions, it's because of the economics of higher ed and the way higher ed is changing, the focus has to be on delivering access as opposed to ownership and curation. I mean, we see this with ebooks. We're licensing millions of ebooks. We don't own them, but this is exactly what we're doing. And I think that's been the message I've had with my faculty is we are changing the way you access your content. It's not going to be, we're not buying anything just in case anymore. It's always going to be focused on just in time. So we'll get you whatever you need, whenever you need it. But if you want it in 10 seconds, it's just not going to happen. And I think that's something that's tough for them to hear because of time and convenience. But it's a message that people can really, it resonates and people get it. They might not like it, but they understand it because they know that the resources are so tight on these campuses, and particularly at public institutions.
And Elaine, just to, I think, build on that a little bit, there was a question that came in asking if you could speak a little bit more about metrics that you find valuable. And, you know, I think I'll just say, I think some of what, you know, you're talking about here is how to think about value in the context of, you know, assessing the different decisions that you're making. Here, the specific question was about whether you could think about metrics that you use thinking about discipline sizes. I'm not exactly sure what that is referring to, but you know, I think if you could expand a little bit more about metrics and how you think about value, that might be of interest, because that's what we're circling around here a lot is, you know, is it metrics about usage on the site? Is it metrics about usage overall? Or is it in fact maybe not, you know, as I think you were saying before, usage is not really the only thing that's driving your thinking here, and that seems important.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the examples is I had a conversation with a faculty member, I believe, in Romance Studies, and her area of study is Arabic. And it's really interesting, though, because every campus, most campuses typically have a linguistics or Romance Studies or some area of like this, but the size varies. And the so-called quality of the department in terms of how much research it produces and things like that, how many students it enrolls, it varies. But, you know, she made this really good point where she said, you know, if you were to compare my top journal with the top journal in pharmacy, that's not an equitable case, right? You can't do that. And although, you know, I might, you know, it might be, you know, if you did a cost per use, you know, it's, you know, $600 cost per use. If you use that metric, you know, there are going to be some areas that are just going to lose off the bat every time. And then, you know, we sat down and she told me about how she publishes in this journal, how much she reads it. Then we looked at other faculty in the department. And so it was really one of those eye openers that told me that the disciplinary differences are significant, and we can't do a one size fits all to set up a metric for value. And so I do think there are values there are metrics that are more attuned to the social sciences and the humanities, and then there's the arts, and then there's the health sciences and life sciences that are very different. And I think right now we're grappling with this idea as a library. It's like, well, what are those metrics, and how do we use these metrics to make assessments about the content that we should have? And that's something that we're working on right now. But it's tough because it really is, it's not solely a financial decision. And I think, I'm looking to other institutions for ideas to help us make a more informed decision, because it's not, if we do cost per use, that's just a killer for a lot of areas, and we really don't want to do that.
Yeah, and I imagine that a publisher or a platform that has content from across several of those areas, those fields that you were talking about, must add even further to the complexity of, do you evaluate them in one way or another? Or is there a way to hybridize the assessment? That must add even further to the complexity. Mm-hmm. I see a sort of two-part question that came in that I want to. I think there's a way to frame this for all three of you to try to address. So, what analytics could be collectible from alternative disseminators such as ResearchGate? So I think that's really a question for Jonathan and Todd. But and sort of the second part of that is, what's the risk of data loss to publishers in partnering with those third-party platforms? So like what data can you collect and what data can't you have access to? It's sort of a reminder to me how much of the future of really all of the providers in our sector, whether it's on the library side or the publisher side, is really about using data and analytics to better understand and support our users. And so, I think there may be, Elaine, you kind of touched on this through some privacy. So I think there's some really interesting questions here, both about the relationship between the publisher and this third-party platform, if there is to be a relationship there, but also with the library in terms of what data does it want or not want, as the case may be, in order to better understand and support its users. So maybe Todd and Jonathan, you could start, and Elaine, if you wanted to sort of add a library perspective as well, I think that would be really helpful.
Well, I'm happy to. I think the unique asset, for instance, ResearchGate has is just this audience data. Researchers voluntarily create profiles and tell ResearchGate who they are and what they're interested in through sort of their behavioral signals, and also what they're willing to share, so they can extract more value out of the network. And that's never been around before. So, keeping in mind the sort of privacy concerns Elaine had, which I think are really important and valid, especially like the history of libraries and maintaining that sort of patron transaction relationship. And as you shift into this world where, you can actually have audience measure like other kinds of media do, which we don't have in STM publishing, so that you can start understanding how things are used and who's using and where you should be publishing and what the fields are and what people are talking about, and just like those kind of signals, which you just don't get today at all. I think that's potentially transformative. I don't know what it means, but I think it's a very interesting question.
So I think let me just make sure I'm tracking on this. So you're suggesting, if in a partnership with a third-party provider, that provider could send back analytics at an individual level, or with greater specificity about who is this user, that could potentially help a publisher to better improve its offerings in one way or another.
It's kind of just it's an audience question. So research has a long tail of interest. So let's say I'm an adeno scientist. There's 400 people in the world who are going to understand my paper. Theoretically, something like ResearchGate could find out who those 400 people are and send my paper to them and figure out what they think of my paper.
Right.
So, that kind of thing to me is powerful. I don't know, and I understand it's a complicated question, but it only works when the users want to volunteer their profile information, because they're getting more value out of it than they're giving, So I think that's the new thing. That's where ResearchGate, for instance, or anybody that maintains a social graph, it's basically a social network kind of a problem. That has really extreme potential for content providers. I just don't know what that all means yet, because there's so many. It's such a loaded question, and there's always this fear of being even more disintermediated from your audience. and all of that stuff. So there's, anyways.
Jonathan or Elaine, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly the most important thing here is privacy and respecting privacy, and that is our first, second, and third priority. And in working with ResearchGate, that is always in our minds. The people who the researchers who decide to work with ResearchGate are ResearchGate's customers. They're not Springer Nature's customers. What we're doing at the moment really is understanding the usage of the content that we've shared. And we don't know right now how that would be used and interpreted by librarians. And so essentially the next step in terms of our work with ResearchGate, going beyond tuning the experience that we talked about earlier and understanding some of the different patterns that we've seen, is really reaching out to librarians, explaining what we've done in this past 12 months, what we've learned, and really to how best we can connect them to what's going on with the content. And so we're starting that research now. That's where we are at the moment. And if librarians want to take part in those conversations, we're very happy to work with them.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is I think Jonathan and Todd are bringing up some really important issues because of the amount of data that we actually will have access to. And, yesterday I had to spend a lot of time with society editors and to hear about how societies are really, they're struggling, generally speaking. And they actually have good data about their users. I mean, these societies are, I would say, have even more intimate relationships with their users than the library would, or even independent societies, that is, than, let's say, a Wiley or Springer Nature. And so they have the data, but I think they're struggling on how to use it to create a better experience, or how to use it to add value. And so so I agree that we do have access to data that we've never had before, and we have to find a way to use that for good and not sacrifice privacy in the process.
That's a great place for us to end today. I can't thank all three of you enough. This has been a tremendously informative and strategically informed set of perspectives. And I think we all know that there's a lot of important experiments and transitional work taking place right now. And you three are at the forefront of that. So I thank you so much for giving us your time and your wisdom today. Jeff, I'll turn things back over to you now.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was an excellent session. Thank you for organizing. Thanks as well to Elaine, Jonathan, and Todd for engaging in this fantastic discussion. And thank you to our audience for attending as well. Finally, our thanks to the Web of Science group for sponsoring our session today. Once again, please do take time to respond to the webinar evaluation that you will receive in your email. Your feedback will help us to continually improve this webinar program. Please also keep an eye out for the 2020 webinar schedule that'll be coming out soon. And with that, we are concluded for the day. Thank you.